welcome to episode 34 of the barn door restoration. Last episode, I failed at making the lower bulkhead panel. A little bit more work retooling before I can reattempt that. I did get the press widened, and that works great. I should have done that long ago, I guess. Now this episode, rear apron brackets. It seemed like a nice simple project to do in this hot weather. So barn doors, once you remove the rear apron, are completely open into the engine area. It's the same with the later splits also. So the rear apron bolts on, sets across here, bolts with 2 bolts each side, has a spot for the engine cover to latch in. And it's a pretty heavy piece. It's sort of structural. These frames are quite flimsy, and there's really not much to hold the bottom sides of the body. Now on the later splits, the header for the engine lid is quite low, so that's quite structural. But on barn doors, the engine lid comes way up, so there's very little support on these back corners from side to side. So the apron actually becomes a structural item. Now these brackets are 1.5 millimeter steel, so about 16 gauge. I thought they were 1.3 millimeter, but when I measured them, they're definitely 1.5. The brackets are the same side to side, but they're not symmetrical. So what I mean by that is the brackets folded up, and there's holes on the one side, and there's holes on the other side, because these are off center a little bit. So what they did is they just rotated the bracket, put it on the other side, and welded the nuts on the other 2 holes. So what happens is you see the seam here where it's folded over, but on this side the seam is actually within the frame rail. When they folded it over, they just spot welded top and bottom. And when this is mounted in the frame, they just put a bead of weld across the top along the edge of the frame. And then there's a short bead of weld inside the frame. There's no weld on the back side here anywhere. Now there's something I did notice. When I went to install these, I noticed my frames are kind of twisted on the back. The top flange, the bottom flange are horizontal. The frame is completely flat here, but when it comes to the back section, it tips out on the bottom. It does the same on both sides, and I was going to straighten it, and I thought, this kind of looks like it might have been factory. So the way they pressed these, it might not have had a good pressing on the end. I had a frame out of a 1960 bus that I recovered, and it was pretty rotten, but it still had the side on it, and it also had the same twist. So I decided to leave it there. It doesn't really matter where the frame is on these. It's this bracket and these holes that are important. Because the floor doesn't really matter where it sets on this, and then the rear pillar comes down, welds to these brackets, so it doesn't really care where the frame is either. So my old brackets are in pretty bad shape. They were bent quite badly. It looks like they were yanked on, and it appears that someone might have bolted a bar across and then pulled on it, because of the way it pulled around the bolt holes. They also drilled the outside hole through next to the nuts that were welded in. So whatever they put on didn't line up right. So it's been modified a bit and then yanked on, and then it was kind of buckled around. This one wasn't terribly rusty. The bottom section here was thin. The rest of it wasn't too bad. So interestingly, where these folded over, on that one and this side of this one were a lot of little spot welds along. On this side had 1 spot weld that was holding, and it kind of ripped out. There's no sign of spot welds anywhere else on that lip, so I think they might have just missed them when it was built. The other side was also bent, pulled out, and drilled out. This one was quite rusty. There's some really deep pitting in it, so it was easier to rebuild, to make new ones than it was to try to rebuild these ones. As to build these is relatively easy. So I drew these up in CAD and as a sheet metal part, and then made an unfolded pattern. I was able to just print out my pattern one-to-one, trace it out, and cut it, which works really nice for getting the exact part. I did have to change my drawings. These drawings were uploaded with the rear frame, and I had it as 1.2 millimeter steel, so I changed those drawings to 1.5. Wouldn't really change the pattern much, not noticeably. So to fold them up was a bit tricky to try and get all the folds in my break. I started by basically bending it in half, right up the back side. And then I could put it in the break and do the two small bends. The problem was the way it's shaped. I couldn't actually bend it up 90, but it's enough to get it up about 45. And then I just take a block of wood and a hammer and bend it over the rest of the way. With it clamped in the break, it makes a real good opportunity to bend it over. And with a block of wood, keeps the bend nice and smooth. You never want to actually hit the metal with the hammer because you'll mark it and dent it. So if you take a block of something, you can roll it over quite easy. I prefer a piece of hard wood because it's easier on the hands than using a piece of steel. So after I got those two, I flipped it around and did the triangle pieces, brought those up. Now I had to stay away from the end of the break a little bit because of the flange, but it still bent fine. What I ended up, the last little bit of my bend was a little bit bulged, but I was able to just take that and hit it with a hammer and flattened it right out nice to put them together. After that, I spot welded them on. Well, actually, I spot welded the nuts on first, and then I spot welded the seams. Now these have well, I call them a T-nut, but they're basically a nut with a flange that spot welds on. Later splits actually have a square nut that's welded on. Now, most of these nuts around the bus are basically at random. They're in different angles. And when I welded them on this, I wasn't really paying attention. But I realized after, the nuts are perfectly horizontal, or very close to horizontal, on both of these. And when I put mine on, I put them vertical. So I'm not sure if I made a mistake or not. Maybe they were kind of random. It just depended on who welded them that day. But it's possible that they're supposed to be horizontal. But it's a lot of work to remove them, and I decided I didn't care that much. Now to install them, the important part of this is that these bolts will be horizontal, be the right distance back, and the right spacing. And it's a little difficult because these frames are very flexible. There's not much strength in these things. Now I could tighten the bolt down that I have here for the bumper mount spot, but it still would have been hard to get them perfect. So what I did is I just took a piece of wood and I drilled the holes in the exact spacing and bolted the brackets to it, and then I could just slide it on. In the video I took of sliding it on, I had them upside down, so you might notice the holes are actually on the lower side of these instead of the upper. But I swapped it after, but I didn't record it doing that second time. So sliding it over the board ensured that these were aligned perfectly. The height is, as long as the frames are the right height, they're the right height. No big deal. So I need to center it. Easiest way to center it, actually, I found was to put a center mark on it and then look down the bus. So use the hole for the heating duct on the front and the transmission mount on the rear. And that allowed me to get it exactly centered. A little hard to measure, trying to put it measure. I could have put a straight edge up the bus, but line it with your eye. If you have marks to go by, you can get it very accurate. So once I had it centered, I had to adjust it forward and back. So I just measured from the torsion beam back to my wood, got it into position and clamped it. So then I could double check everything. I knew I had the right distance forward and back. It was perpendicular to the center line. It was centered. So then I tacked it in and removed the wood. Now, once the wood is removed, these have quite a bit of flex. And it's quite important that these are in the correct spot. We don't care about the frame rail. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this rear piece of the frame jig. I'm going to move it, cut the ends off, move it back, and put plates for here to keep these aligned, these holes aligned perfectly with a jig. And that way, as I build the body up, I'll ensure that these are correct and my rear apron will bolt on nicely. I guess that's about it for this episode. Next episode, don't know. I'll figure something out. But thanks for the comments. I really enjoy the comments. And thanks for watching.